Oh, there you are. Hello world, hello internet, hello Jason Isaacs. Today we're going to talk about SCOTUS, and the emphasis in this particular presentation is going to be on the short questions, for the very simple reason that I don't think a long question is going to come up. I'm going to have to redo this next year when a long question is more likely to come up. But based upon the patterns that we've seen so far and based upon the various ins and outs of the exam course, it's unlikely to come up. Don't worry, I'm not going to leave you completely alone. I'm going to give you a few ideas for those long questions. Specifically this. There are only really 3 different long questions they can ask you. The first 2 are discrete. Are the Supreme Court politicians in disguise? Is the Supreme Court an imperial judiciary? And the answer to both of those questions is yes. Very definitely yes. Let's deal with the politicians in disguise first. Are they politicians in disguise? Well, let's start off with that whole point that they are political appointments. They are appointed with a political agenda in mind. That means that the Supreme Court will be biased at any given time. At any given stage in history, it will be tipped either towards the progressive side of the equation or towards the conservative side of the equation. It should, all other things being equal, tend towards neutrality in the long term, but at any given time, you're going to have a politically biased bench. Why? Because you've got 9 people who are appointed there by different presidents for different political reasons. So the bench will inevitably be tipped one way or the other. Of course, right now it's 4-4. Well, there are only 8 of them at the time of going to press. Prior to that, it was 4-1-4. But either way, the thing tends towards neutrality. At any given time, you will be able to look at the Supreme Court based upon any decision that comes up and say it's likely to go one way or the other way. So we do have political appointments. The second reason why they're politicians in disguise is because they're asked political questions. Now, by the time a question gets to the Supreme Court, all of the low-hanging fruit has been picked by the lower courts. They've decided whether or not this is within the Constitution or that is outside the Constitution. By the time it gets to the Supreme Court, it's not a simple question of jurisprudence. It's not a question of constitutional fact. Rather, it's a question of opinion. Should people be allowed to take drugs? Should women be allowed to have abortions? Should gay people have the same rights as others? So the question here is political. And if you ask a political organization a political question, then don't be surprised if it gives you a political answer. So political appointments, political questions, they will necessarily deliver political answers. So is the Supreme Court essentially a bunch of politicians in disguise? Yes, they are. Get over it. Oh, the only thing you can do is just make sure that your appointment process is up to snuff so that you're not appointing complete loons to the bench, and that's another question, although it's implicit in this one. Coming back to the idea of the imperial judiciary, do you have an imperial judiciary? That is, do you have a judiciary that is unanswerable to anybody? And the short answer to that has got to be yes, because otherwise you wouldn't have an independent judiciary. But let's look at it this way. All roads lead to SCOTUS. Sooner or later, everything defers to SCOTUS to tell us whether or not the Constitution allows this or does not allow that, whether it's federalism or foreign policy or rights. Everything tends to wind up in the Supreme Court. So fundamentally, the Supreme Court gets to decide on virtually everything. Secondly, it is outside the system of checks and balances, and it necessarily has to be so if you're going to have an independent judiciary. So between the fact that all decisions seem to wind up in SCOTUS and those decisions are essentially irreversible, by definition, you have an imperial judiciary. Now, we take both of those 2 questions, we jam them together, and it brings us to the third question. Can the power of the Supreme Court be justified in a democracy? And this really, I hope you can see, is that it's just the previous 2 questions, politicians in disguise and imperial judiciary. The evaluation there really is what alternatives are on offer and how effective is the appointment process. So between those 3 general questions, most of your long questions on the Supreme Court will be covered. Again, I don't think it's necessarily going to come up this year. Doesn't mean it won't, but you'd be better off focusing on the short side of the equation, which is the relationships between the Supreme Court and various other critical aspects of the course. So we're going to look at those one at a time. The first 2 is Constitution and judicial review. So what is the relationship between the Supreme Court and the Constitution? Well, as with all of these questions, the answer is it depends. It depends upon the individual justice and their approach to the text. So we have our strict constructionalists, people like Clarence Thomas. And their general approach is, if you have a problem with the Constitution, you change the Constitution. Don't go looking for things in the Constitution that simply aren't there. you're just getting even more political than we are most of the time. The Constitution, they say, it is what it is. So the Constitution is what it is. Don't go looking for things in the Constitution that aren't there. And if you've got a problem with that, change the Constitution. And this is perhaps best illustrated in Lawrence's dissent in Lawrence in 2003, where he explained that it was a very silly law, but correcting very silly laws was not his job. Correcting very silly laws is the job of the elected representatives. Next up is originalism. This is the idea that some ideas are implicit in the Constitution, or as they put it somewhere, rights not easily identifiable in the Constitution, but perhaps those rights that are implicit in the concept of ordered liberty or deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition. Those quotes come from various different cases. One was Griswold, I can't remember what the other one was off the top of my head, but they said that there are these rights that are not easily identifiable in the Constitution, but they are implicit in the concept of ordered liberty and deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition. And that essentially is originalism, and you can find lots of cases that are going to back you up on that. I'm not going to go into that right now, because if I did, this presentation would last forever. What I will do, of course, is to move on to the third one, which is loose constructionism. The idea here is that sometimes the Constitution needs to be stretched to fit. We've got society, which is moving like this, we've got Congress, which is moving like that, and then right behind that, we've got the Constitution. So can we stretch the Constitution to fit? And in those instances, we're generally looking for something that is ESOD, an evolving standard of decency. We used to execute our children, we don't anymore. We used to execute those who were mentally, who were not fully cognizant. We don't do that anymore. We used to have crimes penalizing gay sex. We don't do that anymore. Why? Because we recognize an evolving standard of decency, which is usually bundled up in the 14th Amendment and substantive due process. In other words, we have to go even further and make sure that everyone is getting a fair crack of the whip. So an evolving standard of decency, you can see it in gay rights, in executing children, and executing the mentally impaired. So these are your three different approaches to the Constitution, and the relationship between the bench and the Constitution will fall into one of those categories, or of course, when you've got 9 of them, any combination of that. So let's move on and have a look at the concept between the approach between the relationship, between the court and judicial review. Now, judicial review refers to 2 particular areas. First, your elected representatives, and second, precedent. So judicial review applies both to what other people are doing and what previous courts have been doing. So if you're looking at precedent, for example, the overturning of a decision is an implicit recognition or an explicit recognition that mistakes were made. Or maybe it was something else. Maybe something has changed. Maybe the court recognizes an evolving standard of decency. That will vary from case to case. But you need to know that judicial review is all about the approach to the will of the elected representatives and indeed precedent. When the court is said to be active, then what they are doing is they are prepared to overturn the will of the elected representatives, or indeed to overturn precedent. The alternative, of course, is to be restrained when they defer to the will of elected representatives, or indeed they defer to precedent. And again, you should have lots of examples to back that up. The only one I'm going to give you is this little quote here. This was John Roberts' dissent in Sibelius, where he said, between 2 possible interpretations of a statute, by one of which it would be unconstitutional and the other constitutional, and by the other valid, our plain duty is to uphold that, or to adopt that which will uphold the act. Our plain duty, the job of the Supreme Court, being appointed rather than elected, is to defer to the elected representatives whenever they possibly can. This really is a nice way of trying to establish exactly what judicial self-restraint is, and you would be well advised to commit it to memory, or at least memorize the general intent. So that's the first set of critical relationships you need to know when you're looking at the Supreme Court. The relationship between the court and the Constitution, the relationship between the court and the general idea of judicial review. Are they active or are they restrained? Let's move on to the next set. And the next set are the way in which this court serves as a broker between the state and the federal government, and then of course the ideological balance of the court itself. Now, when it comes to the relationship between the state and the federal government, you need to know your power clauses, that is power, interstate commerce, elastic and supremacy. And you also need to know your 10th Amendment, which is this. Now, the General Welfare Clause is also there. The General Welfare Clause appears, the concept of general welfare appears twice in the Constitution. But to be honest, it's never really used. It's not considered specific enough or helpful enough, really. And so the Supreme Court has tended not to reach for the General Welfare Clause when it's been making a decision defining the relationship between the states and the federal government. It has tended instead to focus on these two areas. And again, I'm not going to go into this in a huge amount of detail, but we're now moving into federalism. You should have cases by the plenty that demonstrate all of these. If you haven't, drop me in line, I'll let you know. But the relationship between the court and the federal government and state governments is a critical part of their job. They are the arbiter when it comes to the balance of power between the state and the federal government. Progressives and Conservatives, well, this obviously comes into play when we're looking at appointment, and this is very much in the news at the minute, with Judge Garland still out there, hanging in some sort of judicial limbo. That's looking there at the relationship between the executive and the Senate, and of course that brings into play the issue of neutrality, and as I mentioned earlier, neutral only ever in the long term. There's always going to be a short-term balance on the court. And independence is very, very important. You can't really get rid of a Supreme Court justice only for high crimes and misdemeanors. They only ever tried to impeach one justice, that was Samuel Chase, and that was back in the 19th century, and that failed. So we haven't seen many judges kicked out of office. We haven't even seen many judges impeached, in fact. So you need to know all about this. This is going to be about the balance of the Supreme Court, the neutrality of the Supreme Court, the independence of the Supreme Court, and of course, the importance of the appointment process. So that's another key relationship that you need to have under your belt. Next up is very, very simple. It's how powerful is the Supreme Court? Does it have agency? Does it have a lack of agency? Well, in one sense, the Supreme Court is incredibly powerful. They can, of course, overturn Congress and presidential will. That's massive power. And of course, once that's been done, there's nothing either Congress or the Supreme Court can do specifically to overturn that particular decision. There are only two ways really to respond to a judicial decision. You can't change it. You can only respond. You have to sit and wait for the court to change, which is what happened with McConnell to Davis, 03 to 08. Of course, you've got the pivot there in the middle of 05. You should know all about that. I'm not going to go into that in more detail. Or you can change the Constitution. And the last time that happened was in 1913, when the 16th Amendment came in as a response to Pollock. So in terms of agency, they are extraordinarily powerful in one sense. However, in another sense, they're less powerful. They can do nothing to enforce a decision, and of course, you should all know about Brown and Brown 2. It cannot entrench a decision, and that's the whole process of judicial activism again, and the response to precedent. Finally, the Constitution can be changed, as I just mentioned, with the 16th Amendment, and that is just about it. So this can only hear cases brought to it, and of course, the Patriot Act has never really been properly challenged in the court. Unreasonable search and seizure? I would think so. But that's it, really, for the short answers. If you want to go into these in more detail, then we're going to have to do that in a different occasion, because this is already way over schedule. Specific relationships, yeah, we're now into specific questions, and that's a different presentation. So good luck. If you've got any questions, do let me know. Speak to you soon.